Hi everyone, and welcome to Voice of Geekdom. This is the latest video in a continuing series which examines the text of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Silmarillion. You can find a link to the entire playlist in the description. Don't forget to leave this video a like to help the channel out, and leave your comments and questions for me below. And if you're not already subscribed, make sure to hit the big red button below, as well as the bell icon to activate notifications. Last time, in Chapter 5, we read about the elves' early migration west coming to its conclusion after the 2 trips across the ocean aboard the moving island of Eressëa. We were told that, upon arrival, the 3 kindreds settled in Valinor separately, with the Vanyar led by High King Ingwe settling on Manwë's holy mountain Taniquetil, the Noldor led by King Finwë in the Calakiria Valley and centred around the hilltop city of Tirion, and the Teleri led by Olwë at their newly founded coastal haven of Alqualondë, the Haven of the Swans. Towards the end of the chapter, we were introduced to the Noldor ruling family, and to Feanor, who is the topic of today's chapter. Cura Finwë was his name, but by his mother he was called Feanor, Spirit of Fire, and thus he is remembered in all the tales of the Noldor. In the years that followed their great journey into the west, the elves live in peace and prosperity, and Valinor was a land of great bliss. The Noldor in particular, under the leadership of Finwë, have made great advancements in that time, and none more so than the development of the written word, attributed here to the lawmaster Rhu'mil. Although this fact is not mentioned here, Rhu'mil is also assumed to have been the original recorder of the Ainulindale. Thus it was his work which was later translated and published by Bilbo in the opening book of the Silmarillion, which we read earlier. Rhu'mil's alphabet, which was created for Tolkien's early Quenya language, was known as the Sarati. The Sarati, which was written vertically from top to bottom, was then later replaced by the Tengwa, which is the common elven script that we are more used to seeing. And Tengwa was developed by Feanor himself, referred to in the appendices of The Lord of the Rings as the Feanorian letters. Feanor, you will remember, was the firstborn son of Finwë, and the only child ever born of Miriel, Finwë's first wife. Miriel bore no more children for Finwë after giving birth to Feanor, when she was consumed in spirit and body, and after his birth she yearned for release from the labour of living. And when she had named him, she said to Finwë, "Never again shall I bear child, for strength that would have nourished the life of many has gone forth into Feanor." She is taken to the gardens of Lorien, and there she lay down to sleep. But though she seemed to sleep, her spirit indeed departed from her body, and passed in silence to the halls of Mandos. For a race of immortal beings, this may strike you as a little strange that Miriel's body would just give up on her like this after childbirth. In the published Silmarillion, this is where Miriel's story ends, and we are left to wonder about her sudden demise. Tolkien wrote a really fascinating expanded version of her story though as part of the redrafting process that he began after the publication of The Lord of the Rings, which was eventually published in Book 10 of the History of Middle-earth series, Morgoth's Ring. In Morgoth's Ring, the Valar convene one of their council meetings in order to discuss the petition of Finwë to be allowed to remarry after Miriel's death. Several Valar who are not often heavily featured speak up during this meeting, before Mandos has the final word and passes judgment on the matter. This section of Morgoth's Ring is well worth a read after you're done with the Silmarillion. Not only because we get to read for the first time dialogue from previously mute Valar like Nienna and Vaere, but because of the richness of their discussion in general, as the Valar ponder the mystery of Miriel's spirit leaving its body and the metaphysical implications of that. To summarise, Finwë and Miriel are granted a sort of posthumous divorce by the Valar, and then the marriage to Indis is allowed and Finwë remarries. Miriel's body is still unwithered in Lorien, and it is explained that Miriel's spirit returns to its body after Finwë dies later on. She then puts her famous skill at embroidery to use as a servant to Mandos' spouse, the aforementioned Vaere the Weaver. For whatever reason, this version of the narrative was not included in the Silmarillion by Christopher, and we move swiftly on with the story of Feanor, who, in any case, grows up without his mother's nurturing. Finwë dotes on his son, who is given every advantage in life. Shortly after Feanor comes into adulthood, he takes a wife called Nerdanel, who is the daughter of a smith named Matan, who was already famed amongst the Noldor. Feanor had inherited his mother's skill with her hands, and from his father-in-law Matan, he learned much of the making of things in metal and in stone. Nerdanel and Feanor had 7 sons, who were listed in the previous chapter. We skipped over this section in the last video for the sake of brevity, but now seems a good time to revisit. Maethros the Tall was the eldest son, and was a close friend to his cousin Fingon, who was the son of Feanor's brother Fingolfin. The second son was Maglor the Mighty Singer, whose voice was heard far over land and sea. The House of Feanor will be responsible for some of the ugliest and most dishonourable acts of the First Age, but both of these two also display redeeming qualities at times, though they eventually come to tragic ends. Cellegorm the Fair was a friend of Orome, and often followed the Valar's Horn. This friendship will be referenced back later on as part of the Beren and Luthien story, when we meet Huan, the Hound of Valinor, a gift to Cellegorm from Orome. The next son was Caranthir the Dark, a reference to his dark hair. Then there was Curufin the Crafty, who, as well as having inherited most of his father's skill of hand, was also later on, after returning to Middle-earth, the father of the famous Celebrimbor, who would be deceived by Sauron into forging the Rings of Power in the Second Age. Finally, the 2 youngest were the twin brothers Amrod and Amras, who were also renowned as hunters. As well as clearly creating lots of male heirs, it was also during this time that Feanor created the Tengwa alphabet, as we said earlier, and crucially learned about jewel smithing. The first gems that Feanor made were white and colourless, but being set under starlight they would blaze with blue and silver fires brighter than Helluin, and other crystals he made also, wherein things far away could be seen small but clear, as with the eyes of the eagles of Manwë. Seldom were the hands and mind of Feanor at rest. Helluin was one of the stars that we were told about in Chapter 3, the star known today as Sirius, and part of the constellation Orion, which you may remember was known as Menelmacar to the elves, the swordsman of the sky. And those other crystals, which were capable of seeing faraway things, sure do sound quite familiar, don't they, Lord of the Rings fans? In fact, this is probably not a coincidence, as we know from the Index of Names at the back of the book that the Seeing Stones of Numenor were originally created by Feanor. So this is a veiled reference to the famous Seeing Stones themselves, which we later see in the hands of Saruman and of Denethor II in The Lord of the Rings. When Finwë remarries, Feanor resents his stepmother Indis, who is not a Noldor but is instead of the fair-haired Vanyar elves, and close kin to Ingwe the High King. And he has no love for his half-brothers Fingolfin or Finarfin either, although some of his children do have close relationships to their cousins. The narrator speculates here on what might have been if Finwë had not remarried. In those unhappy things which later came to pass, and in which Feanor was the leader, many saw the effect of this breach within the house of Finwë, judging that if Finwë had endured his loss and been content with the fathering of his mighty son, the courses of Feanor would have been otherwise, and great evil might have been prevented. Although this could be true, debatable as it may be, the text goes on to say here that the children of Indis were great and glorious, and their children also, and if they had not lived, the history of the Eldar would have been diminished. Which seems to be the narrator's way of saying, and then we wouldn't have had much of a story. In any event, Melkor is the root cause of all of the trouble which is about to begin with Feanor and the Noldor, and of all evil in the world, it would seem. And with the noontide of the Blessed Realm in its fullest glory, the time is ripe for him to re-enter our picture. Melkor, as the Valar had decreed, completed the term of his bondage, dwelling for 3 ages in the duress of Mandos, alone. At length, as Manwë had promised, he was brought again before the thrones of the Valar. Then he looked upon their glory and their bliss, and envy was in his heart. He looked upon the children of Ilúvatar that sat at the feet of the mighty, and hatred filled him. He looked upon the wealth of bright gems, and he lusted for them, but he hid his thoughts, and postponed his vengeance. Melkor grovels before the Valar, seeking to absolve his reputation of his rebellious past, and, although not all of them trust him, Manwë rules that he should be allowed his freedom again, under one condition. He must not venture out of their sight, and must stay within the holy city of Valmar. It is interesting that it is Manwë himself who rules on this, and not Mandos, whose task it is usually to pass judgments and to make rulings. Perhaps it is because the judgment relates to one of their own order, and not to the children of Ilúvatar, but the narrator even takes note of Mandos' silence on the matter, as well as the fact that Ulmo still does not trust his act, and neither does Tolkas, who clenched his hands whenever he saw Melkor his foe go by, which is just a really amusing image. We know Melkor's repentance is just an act, of course. Melkor's play here is to play the long game, look for an angle, and to convince the children of Ilúvatar to create their own downfall. Melkor tries first to get inside the ears of the Vanyar, but they are not fooled by his words any more than Ulmo is, and they held him in suspicion. He ignores completely the Teleri, which we will see later on is probably quite a big miscalculation on his part. But the Noldor serve his needs quite nicely indeed, being both powerful as well as prideful and thirsty for greater understanding of the world. The Noldor took delight in the hidden knowledge that he could reveal to them, and some hearkened to words that it would have been better for them never to have heard. Feanor's actions will definitely be influenced by Melkor's lies later on, but the narrator claims here that, up until this point at least, Feanor had held no converse with him and took no counsel from him. For Feanor, was driven by the fire of his own heart only. Next time, we will see that fire within Feanor reach critical mass as he creates his greatest treasures, the 3 Silmarils, and Melkor will begin to sow the first seeds of rebellion in the land of Aman.